Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. I want to also thank the folks that are joining us online. This will be live streamed tonight, like most of our programming. My name is Nikki Check. I am the development, I always say that, the director of development here at the Natural History Institute. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, there's a few items of housekeeping. Restrooms are located in this corner, but you have to walk all the way around to get to them. There's also drinking fountains back there. There's two upcoming programs I want you guys to know about. The first is a webinar entitled Teaching Care for the World. That's on Tuesday, February 14th. And we have a cactus and agave collecting workshop with the renowned Mark Baker, Saturday, February 18th, here at NHI. Also, the beautiful orator collection is up in the gallery through April 14th. And my last announcement is that we are a nonprofit and we depend on donations from lovely people like you. So if you like tonight's program, please consider giving a donation either online or on the other side of that wall is a cash box. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Maurice Crandall tonight. Dr. Crandall is an associate professor of history at Arizona State University. He previously taught at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and he's a citizen of the Yavapai-Apache Nation. I want to take just a moment here to celebrate the fact that we're able to present an indigenous professor from a university here tonight to talk about the other side of American history and to tell some of the stories that have not had the opportunity to be told until recently. Professor Crandall is an award-winning author who has presented his research throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe. His book, These People Have Always Been a Republic, Indigenous Electorates and the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, is for sale online, and I hear that he's working hard on his next book about the Yavapai-Apache Scouts. He received his PhD in history from the University of New Mexico, and he's a proud graduate of Mingus Union High School in Cottonwood. He and his wife currently live in Phoenix, and we're so glad that they can join us here tonight. Everybody, Dr. Maurice Crandall.
Thank you very much, Nikki, for that introduction. I appreciate it. It's always weird to hear yourself talked about in the third person. I'm really happy to be here with you tonight. I hope that the volume is adequate. I'll try to speak loudly as well so that I project. I think this is the first time I've been to Prescott in probably 5 years. As was mentioned, I grew up in the Verde Valley and also in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So I'm a Southwesterner, but I went to Mingus. And as a teenager, we would drive over the mountain and come to Prescott, which was the big city. And we'd be down at the square at Courthouse Plaza, just, I don't know, doing what teenagers do. And before the talk, my wife and I went to the square just to see, because I had a memory that there's a Veterans Memorial that had my grandfather's name on it. I thought for sure that it was there, and we didn't find it immediately, but then we did, and sure enough, I was right. There was my grandfather who was a veteran from Yavapai County, and several other tribal members. So if you see Russell is a common Yavapai last name, not because it's an indigenous name, but because probably the agent at the reservation, his name was Russell, and he said, okay, you're a Russell now, when they're writing people down, because they couldn't pronounce the names. But Quail is another name, Sign. There's Russells here at Yavapai Prescott as well. They're relatives. Some of my memories too, being at Mingus and playing sports against Prescott and Bradshaw Mountain. I ran cross country and played soccer, and we played a snowpocalypse soccer game once against Prescott High here in Prescott, and it literally was snowing and it was cold, very cold. But I've never been here in this capacity. I've never given a talk in Prescott, so it's good to be here. And I want to start by showing a few things that are more of a personal nature. This first slide, which will come up there. this is my family in the 1930s. And that's my grandfather, Ned. Those are my grandparents, Henry and Daisy Russell. That's his brother, Rudy, his younger brother, Bobby. Naomi and Aggie is the youngest, and Aggie's the only one who's still living today. And she just turned 90, I believe, just the other week. So this is a typical Native family in Clarkdale. This is in Clarkdale in the 1930s. And so I'm a Russell through my mom, and like I said, that's a prominent Yavapai family. If you meet a Native family from the area and the last name is Russell, they're typically Yavapais. I was sort of raised as, this was my second father, my grandfather Ned, and he graduated from Clarkdale High School, back when there was a Clarkdale High School. Here he is as a young man, but then playing football for Clarkdale High back in the days of no concussion protocol. And it's possible that some of you longtime Prescott residents, I still don't know what a person from Prescott is called. Prescottonian, all right. They don't teach you that in high school in Cottonwood. But one of the mail carriers was Dan Russell, who was a Yavapai and delivered mail here in Prescott for many years, and that's my grandfather's first cousin. And those Russells now live in Fort McDowell, Phoenix area. But the reason that I tell you this is sort of to give you a little bit of my bona fides as a local boy, but I think it's important so that you know that the history that I'm talking about today is personal. It matters to me. It matters to my family. It matters to the people who are from here and whose land this is and continues to be. And these are our ancestral lands, and our ancestors are buried in these hills and in the Verde Valley. And like I said, my grandfather's name is on the monument there in the square. So this is all very personal to me. A lot of times scholars, the work they do, there's a distance, and some people say that that's the way you need to approach your work, from a sort of dispassionate distance. And I disagree, especially when it's indigenous history, because too many times that history has been told by people who have no stake in those communities and maybe haven't done it in the most ethical way. So the topic for today is research that I'm currently doing. They told me that I should bring copies of my first book because I could sell them, but I don't actually have any copies on hand. So it's easily locatable on Amazon, or University of North Carolina Press is the press, so you can find it there. That's my first research, which has to do with, my first book had to do with Native American voting and enfranchisement. That's a political history of Native peoples in Arizona and New Mexico from the Spanish period, colonial era, through the early 20th century, through statehood in 1912. And this research for today is what I'm currently working on. It's a second book, and it's about Yavapais and Apaches that served as U.S. Army Indian Scouts. And I'm interested in this primarily, well, for a number of reasons. One, because every family has some sort of connection to the Scouts. If you go back far enough, all of us have an ancestor that in some way was involved in Army campaigns as a Scout. But I also think that there's more to the story than has commonly been portrayed. There are Scouts that many have heard of that make their way into the Western lore and the lore of Western history. People like Alchese, who's a famous White Mountain Apache Scout here on the left. This is him as an elderly man. He won a Congressional Medal of Honor as a Scout during campaigns in the 1870s. And then there was Mickey Free. You might have heard of Mickey Free. He was actually half Mexican and half Anglo-American. He was the son of a mixed ancestry family in southern Arizona, and he was kidnapped by Apaches that precipitated the whole Bascom affair, and what led to the Apache Wars. Basically, it was over a young captive boy, and a group of Apaches was wrongly accused of having kidnapped him. They weren't actually the people who did it, and when the army said, "Give us the boy back," they didn't have a boy to give back because they hadn't actually kidnapped him, and he'd gone to the White Mountain Apache tribe, which is far away from southern Arizona. It's farther up north in eastern Arizona. He eventually ended up there. So he was raised Apache and then became a scout during the Apache Wars because he was essentially trilingual, and he could be an interpreter, so he knew Spanish, which he had grown up in Spanish and English household, and he knew Apache, and some people say about Mickey Free that he was half, I forget what the saying is, half Mexican, half Irish, and all son of a bitch, or something like that. And you can read about Mickey Free, and it's a fascinating story, and it's an important story, and it's the type of thing that has brought the interest of a lot of history buffs and historians alike. And those are stories that I appreciate and I like. I like the history of the campaigns and the heroic deeds and the hero tales, but that's not necessarily what my talk is about today. Those things have received their attention. I'm more concerned with meanings, cultural meanings. What did it mean to be a scout? How did it affect these men and their communities? And the scouts were all men, but how did it affect their families? Why did they do it? Why agree to serve in the US Army as a scout, the army that had just displaced and conquered your people? Why would you do that? And then ultimately, what happened when these men went back to their communities after the wars were over? And that's why the talk title is After the Whirlwind. Did it still affect them? Did it have an impact on their lives and their communities? Was there something fundamentally important to what they had done that then impacted the history of those communities in places like Prescott, Camp Verde, Clarkdale, Fort McDowell, and elsewhere? And so all of this is from a community perspective, an indigenous perspective. And the disclaimer would be, I don't claim to be the expert on this. I'm among experts. But a lot of what I present today comes from talking to people and listening to people, elders who tell these stories. And I've given talks where they've been in the audience, and I always say, if I get anything wrong, come and tell me afterwards, please. But these are their stories, and those are the real experts that I defer to ultimately. So to give a little historical context, there are probably things that you might not know about scouting. It's as old as colonialism. It's a tactic of colonizers that once they defeat an indigenous group, they often then employ those people to fight for their own colonial nation-state army. The French did it, the British did it, the United States did it. And so it's not a new thing. And when these guys are scouting in the 1870s and after, it's a long established tradition. Army Indian soldiers, primarily as scouts, fought in basically every war for the United States. And even preceding that, from the French and Indian War to the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War. A lot of people don't know that General Grant's chief of staff was a Seneca named L.A. Parker, who then went on to become the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. But he drew up the surrender papers at Appomattox Courthouse. They were written by a Seneca native guy. When Phillips St. George Cook of Mormon Battalion fame that came through this region campaigned against Hickory Apaches and Utes in New Mexico, he used a company of Taos Pueblo soldiers as scouts. But it goes back even further than that. Some of you may have or may not have heard of the so-called Peace Apaches of the Spanish era. Spain fought Apaches for decades during the 1700s and even before in the Southwest. And you can see this is a map of New Mexico, Arizona, Sonora, that region. And at a certain point, they realized it was cheaper to feed and clothe Apaches than it was to fight them. And so they tried to lure them to live near Spanish presidios and communities on plots of land, which were sort of proto-reservations, and these were known as peace establishments, and they came to be called the Apaches de Paz, or the Peace Apaches. Part of the deal was they drew rations from the Spanish government in the form of corn, cigarettes, brown sugar, part of a butchered steer, and then leaders were given additional gifts, often clothing, jackets, shoes, guns, soap, bridles, chocolate, even horses. And while most who participated in this system lived in their own encampments near Spanish presidios, some actually lived in the Spanish fortifications themselves. And the system was in place from about 1790 to 1830, but it fell apart when Mexico became independent and didn't have the money or wasn't stable enough as a government to keep this going. And they couldn't afford to pay the Peace Apaches anymore. But one of the things that they did as part of this was, it wasn't just that they gave food and supplies to Apaches who agreed to live in these peace establishments. They also asked them to serve as scouts, and many Apaches did, and they served in the Spanish army. So when Juan Bautista de Anza famously defeated Comanches in the early 1700s, he was using Apaches in his force as well, along with Pueblo Indian allies. And so the history of Apache scouting for a colonizer goes back to the early 1700s and beyond. It's not a new phenomenon. And what you see happening in the latter half of the 19th century mirrors this pretty strikingly in a number of ways. But there are important differences. For one thing, Spain couldn't compel Apaches to stay on these peace establishments, and so famously Apaches at places like Janos and the other establishments which are in that Arizona-Sonora border region, they came and went as they pleased. So they would come in and draw rations, maybe serve some time as a scout for the Spanish military on a campaign, but then they would just go and leave, and then come back when they needed more supplies and agree sort of to live there, because the Spanish didn't have the military power to compel them to stay there. Whereas under the US system, things develop a little differently, and when you're on the reservation, you have to stay on the reservation, and that's why the saying going off reservation, which I don't like as a saying, but it refers to people who are supposed to stay within those confines and stay in that area, a very bordered area. Scouts who served in the Spanish military scouted against other Apache groups. They weren't just scouting against Comanches or Navajos, they were scouting against other Apaches. And so that's the same tradition that's later used by the United States a couple of centuries later. So with that historical context in mind, we can fast forward to the middle of the 1800s. The first Indians used as scouts and military allies on campaigns weren't Apaches or Yavapais here in Arizona. They were actually Tohono-O'odhams from southern Arizona, what we would call, historically they were called Papagos or Pimas as well. As well as Pipash or Maricopa peoples from both that far southern Arizona area around Tucson. That's where a lot of Tohono-O'odhams are from, down in this region. But then even farther north, the Gila and Salt Rivers, the Valley of Phoenix today, that's where Akimel-O'odham peoples lived, and as well as Pipash or Maricopas. And they were recruited as scouts initially. The reason is because for O'odham and Pipash peoples, we're their traditional enemies. So when the US government came in and said, hey, we need help fighting against Apaches and Yavapais, they said, sure, we'll help you. We don't like those people. We've been fighting them for a long time. You're a good ally, I guess, or you could be a good ally. So during the Civil War in the first half of the 1860s, Arizona Territory commissioned 5 militia companies, including Company B of Maricopas and Company C of Pimas. And they served during that Civil War era when the regular army was out of Arizona. So there were 2 companies out of 5 that were Indian scouts serving for the US Army. Civil War ends in 65, and 1866 is an important year. It's when Congress passes an act that reformed the military, and one part of that act authorized the president to enlist a force of Indians, quote, not to exceed 1,000, to act as scouts. So it was written into a congressional overhaul of the Army. The scouts who served would receive the same pay as cavalry soldiers. There was no difference in pay between a scout and a regular Army soldier. And they could be discharged whenever their services were no longer needed or at the discretion of the local department commander. And that took effect on August 1st, 1866. Now that allowance for short-term service or to be discharged when they were not needed anymore was really important because regular Army soldiers enlisted for 3 years. No Indian scout wanted to serve for 3 years. They wanted to serve on that campaign for 3 weeks, 3 months maybe, and then go back home. And the Army allowed that because that's what the act called for, so that they could serve short enlistments, and many took advantage of that. So you would go on campaigns, and then you would go back home. You would draw pay, just like a regular Army soldier. You had access to the commissary. You could go and get supplies and whatever was needed for your family, and then you could go home. So that was an important development in 1866. And at this point, some of you may be wondering what scouting is. It might be obvious to some, but for others, maybe less so. Scouting traditionally meant reconnaissance, finding, locating the enemy, and trailing the enemy, finding out their strength, locating their encampments, where they had been, where they were going, general kind of field military intelligence. That's what scouting involved. There was some conventional wisdom in the Army that scouts shouldn't engage in direct combat, that they should just be used for the traditional scouting purposes of finding and locating the enemy, and then that was their job. But the reality was that scouts often fought alongside the regular Army, companies right next to another company, in joint actions. Now, with all that said, there were some who viewed scouts as sort of less than the regular Army soldiers, that they were sort of a lower tier, as if they wasn't as important, or they didn't do the real fighting. And this is a total fallacy. This is absolutely incorrect. Scouts performed essential duties, and here in central Arizona, Yavapais and Apaches who served as scouts were essential in defeating the so-called renegades, those bands like Geronimo's band, who consistently refused to stay on a reservation. They wouldn't have been subdued ultimately if it wasn't for scouts. So when Major John Green of the 1st U.S. Cavalry and an Apache chief that whites referred to as Miguel brokered a peace along the White River in the summer of 1869, it led directly to the first the establishment of Fort Apache. That's what's today White Mountain Apache. It's there on the White River. And that was the beginning of significant Apache scout enlistments for the U.S. Army in 1869 and onward. The first scouts were from White Mountain Apache tribe, who are Western Apaches. There are, culturally distantly related to us, but we have relatives, and I have relatives in Sibique, which is on the White Mountain Reservation. And when General George Crook was sent to Arizona to command the Department of Arizona in 1871, he ramped up the use of scouts significantly. He had the assignment to subdue Apaches and Yavapais in the Rim Country, and here around Prescott after the establishment of Fort Whipple. And so he saw that in order to do that, scouts were essential. At first, he used a variety of scouts, including Pimas, Maricopas, even Wallapais were used as scouts. They were recruited from up north. But Crook and others became convinced that Apaches and Yavapais were the best scouts. They made the best scouts. Crook, I would call him an Apache-phile, even though his job was to locate and kill Apaches and so-called renegades and place us on reservations. He was enamored with Apaches and Yavapais as well. At that time, they didn't know the distinction between the two. They thought Yavapais were just a subgroup of Apaches. They were often called Yuma Apaches or some other Apache subgroup. They're not. Yavapais are human speakers and not linguistically related. They're two separate groups, but they were sort of grouped together, and both were used as scouts by Crook in large numbers. So this is a quote from Crook that I like. Famously in 1886, which is when the final Geronimo campaign ended, he said, "We have before us the tiger of the human species. Apaches were the most thoroughly individualized soldiers on the globe, that each was an army in himself, waiting for orders from no superiors, thoroughly confident in his own judgment and never at a loss to know when to attack or when to retreat. Those are very positive things to say about Apaches. And like I said, it's not a stretch to say that Crook was an Apache file, so much so that this is Crook on his favorite mule, Apache, with his right-hand man, Alchese, that same elderly man in the photo who served as a scout. That's him as a young man, and this is another scout, Dutchie. And they were very close with Crook. And like I said, Alchese won the Congressional Medal of Honor during the Mogollon Rim campaigns in 1872, 73. And I just want to make an important corrective. We often hear about the Apache scouts, but as I've said, and I will continue to point out, Yavapai served in large numbers as scouts as well. Like I said, it was a case of mistaken identity as Mojave Apaches or Yuma Apaches. Those were Yavapais. So, without going too much into the hero tales, sorry if that's what you came for, but I can summarize it this way. Scouts proved their worth in combat. They were consistently reliable from early on in Crook's tenure in Arizona. For example, 22 Congressional Medals of Honor were awarded during the Tonto Basin campaigns in the Rim Country in 1872 and 1873. Which was fought to subdue my Yavapai and Dilzhe'e, which are Tonto Apache's ancestors, and 10 of those Medals of Honor were to scouts. So that's a large number. Alchese was one of them. There were others. And it wasn't just Crook who had this opinion, although he was sort of the main supporter of the scouts and the most vocal. In 1883, he was speaking to the New York Herald, and he said, "The Apaches are the shrewdest and best fighters in the world." And he wasn't alone. While praise wasn't universal, it was close to unanimous. Al Sieber, Charles Gatewood, John Burke, all of these officers who served in Crook's campaigns and who also served alongside scouts said the same things. John Burke, who wrote the classic book On the Border with Crook, if you want, the cavalry account of those campaigns in the 1870s, he said, "The longer we knew the Apache scouts, the better we liked them. They were wilder and more suspicious than the Pimas and Maricopas." I'll put this up so you can see it. "But far more reliable and endowed with a greater amount of courage and daring. I've never known an officer whose experience entitles his opinion to the slightest consideration who did not believe as I do on this subject." Notwithstanding the Sibique incident, where a group of scouts mutinied, they say, they actually turned on the army after the army tried to kill one of our medicine people. So what would you do when a holy man was killed? He was killed right in front of them, and the scouts said, "No, we're not going to do this." And they turned on the army, and a few of them were ultimately executed. But even without that incident, the scouts were pretty much universally praised. So knowing that, I'll take a drink of water quickly. Again, one of my fundamental questions is why? Why did the scouts serve? Why did they agree to serve as scouts for the nation that had just done real harm to their communities, who had killed their people, starved them, burned their homes, driven them onto small reservations and confined them there? Why serve as a scout? And there's no easy answer. There's no single answer that will satisfy that. It's a complicated question and a complicated answer. And we're talking about numerous groups, because Yavapais and Apaches are not just one group of people. There are subgroups, sub-tribes, and bands, and they each had their own reasons and their own opinions. Yavapais here in Prescott had different reasons for enlisting in scout service than Yavapais at Fort McDowell, for example, or from Camp Verde or Clarkdale. And it would be different for each individual even. Each family had their own reasons for doing so. And while we didn't always scout against our own groups, sometimes we did. Sometimes we were asked to scout against our own, potentially family members. For example, when Geronimo surrendered the final time in 1886, it was 2 Chiricahua scouts who knew him personally, named Cayetan and Martin, who went and convinced him to come in. And they were engaged in a scouting action basically against their own people. It was family against family. They had relationships with him. So scouting caused disruptions and bad feelings in our communities. That has to be acknowledged. Vincent Randall, who some of you may know, he's our tribal historian of the Yavapai-Apache Nation. He's an Apache elder. This is a quote from him, where he said, "It's not a pleasant subject with us, although it is of great interest to the general public and gets lots of attention as a noble cause. It was an action brought on by necessity. When I was growing up, my elders did not like to talk about scouts and what they had done. Like death, they did not like to talk about it." And that's an Apache and Yavapai taboo. You typically don't talk about the dead. We know if one of our ancestors was a scout, but nobody ever talked about it. It is a sad episode in our history, and the old-timers really wanted to forget about it. When a man's enlistment was up and the wars were over, the family would do an enemy way ceremony, which is something you would do to purify you after you'd come in contact with enemy people. So all that business was in the past. It didn't exist anymore, and for our people, that is the way it stays. And that tradition persisted. My grandfather, when he got home from World War II in the Pacific and all the fighting and killing he saw in Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, he went and stayed with his uncle at Sibiku, who was a medicine man, got purified, and then went on and didn't talk about the war very much until much later in life when he told me his life story and experiences, and I would relate things to my mom and aunties, and they'd say, "Oh, we didn't know about that. He never talked about that." And it's just sort of part of this mentality. And that's because there's trauma involved. There are bad feelings, like Vincent Randall said, and a lot of pain there. And we're still sorting through that, even over 100 years after the fact. But at the same time, as he also said, almost everyone at Payson and Camp Verde had an ancestor who was a scout for the Army. So we all have somebody in our family tree that did it. And those memories and those scout services, those are what I'm interested in, but in a respectful way, not to bring up the trauma of the past, but to tell stories that need to be told, that haven't been told yet, and to bring attention to those stories. So back to that question, why did they do it? Crook intentionally recruited scouts from among groups that he had just defeated and subdued or had surrendered. It's almost like the day after they surrendered, he said, "Okay, who wants to scout for my army?" And you can see maybe the conundrum that put them in. But we might see those who agreed to do it as engaging in some act of deep betrayal for their own people. But it fails to take into consideration some important points. One crucial consideration is that my people in the Verde Valley, for example, received what we often refer to as the promise, and we call it the promise, Crook's promise. It was actually 2 promises. When Crook came into the Rim Country and subdued our people in the early 1870s, they placed them on a reservation in what's today Cottonwood and Clarkdale. It was called the Rio Verde Reserve. This is the Rio Verde Reserve. So you see Clarkdale is here, Cottonwood is there. At the time, these were pretty much non-existent, but then you go farther here, there's Middle Verde and the town of Camp Verde where the fort was. But this was the reservation. It was called the Rio Verde Reserve. And if you've been to the Verde Valley Yavapai College campus, that's where the agency headquarters were. You've been to the Rio Verde Reserve headquarters. And while it encompassed only a tiny part of our ancestral lands, it was nonetheless in our homeland. And we were promised that we could stay there forever. You know, the old, as long as grass grows and river flows saying. And scouts were recruited from our people when we were on the Rio Verde Reserve, including 46 who were referred to as Apache Yumas, which were actually Yavapais. They enlisted in Second Lieutenant Walter Schuyler's company in 1874, and they served from February until August of 1874. And many Apaches and Yavapais were recruited from the Rio Verde while it was in existence. And so imagine that. Imagine your people have just been subjected to violent campaigns by the Army. You've been forced onto this reservation at the point of a gun. And then the Army comes along and says, we want you to come scout for us against Apaches and Yavapais. This is where the promise that I referred to comes into the picture. The first promise made by Crook was that if we were good Indians and took up farming on the Rio Verde Reserve and helped bring in the renegades, as they were called, then we could live there peacefully on that land forever. So we did it. We did everything that was asked of us, including constructing significant irrigation works, growing crops, becoming the suppliers for Fort Whipple here, because there's no perennial streams in Prescott. They're all on the other side of the mountain. So you have all the creeks and river in the Verde, Middle Verde drainage. And that's where our people grew crops right there on the reserve, and the hay and grains that were grown were then sent over the mountain to supply Fort Whipple, which was the first territorial capital. So we were doing exactly what Crook said: if you do this, you can stay on this reservation forever, which is part of your own lands. And he also said, if you help bring in the renegades, all of this will be over quicker, and you can live peacefully. And so we did that. We scouted for the Army in the hopes that it would bring an end to the struggle as quickly as possible. But as is often the case, the Army broke its promise. And in 1875, the federal government decided to shut down this reservation. And it was primarily driven by merchants in Tucson. They were called the Tucson Ring. And they said, well, I don't want to curse, but they said, these Indians on Rio Verde Reserve are too self-sufficient. We're supposed to have a contract to supply the food and commodities for them. We don't like that. So move them off of there, and let's put all of the Apaches and Yavapais on one reservation at San Carlos. And so that's what they did. So in 1875, in February of 1875, during the winter, they took all of our people and moved us from that reserve, even though we had farmed, dug irrigation ditches, gotten along with the people around us, the non-Indians, scouted for the Army. We'd done all of those things that were asked, and we were relocated to San Carlos. And if you've been to our cultural center, which is in Middle Verde, right by the casino down the hill, there's a memorial there, the Exodus Memorial. And you can see this man, his elderly wife who was sick and couldn't move anymore, and people who couldn't keep going were either left or killed even. And so he took a big burden basket and poked some holes in it and put her inside the basket and on his head and carried her the rest of the way to San Carlos. From the Verde Valley to San Carlos is about 200 miles, and this was done in February when the streams were swollen, when the weather is terrible, and it's cold. And the Army also insisted that we go as the crow flies, not over established easy roads or easier roads. They wanted as direct as possible a route, and so you're crossing mountains and rivers, and it was a terrible, terrible thing. We commemorate that every February at our Exodus Day. So it's the last weekend in February this month. If you want to come to the Verde Valley, you can be there for Exodus Day celebration on that last Saturday. So again, Crook broke his promise, and then when we got to San Carlos, he made another promise. He said, okay, stay in San Carlos for a time, be good Indians, farm, be peaceful, scout for the Army, and then we'll let you go back to the Verde Valley. Maybe 5-10 years, maybe a little more, but as quickly as we can, once all this is over. So over the course of those years, that's what we did, despite living in San Carlos, where it's not like the Verde Valley. It's drier. There wasn't as much good farmland. It was a really hard existence there, but we did it. We farmed, and we also scouted for the Army once again. So when Geronimo's band, for example, left in 1883, or again in 1885-86, our scouts went and tried to help locate him. But instead of being there at San Carlos for 5 or 10 years, we were there 25 years, from 1875 to 1900. And that, again, that promise was broken. And not only that, the Army was very harsh with our people, and when we, tried to go out and pick acorns, which is a traditional food, if you were outside of reservation boundaries without permission, you could be shot. And I've heard relatives tell stories about, old women out gathering acorns and the Army coming out and shooting at them because they're doing that. And so how this relates to scouting is those Apaches who were at San Carlos, who were living, peacefully, the groups who left, like Geronimo's band, for example, made life harder for those who were there. Because every time they would leave, the Army would crack down, and things got more difficult on the reservation. And so it was sort of a vicious cycle. And when Geronimo's band left and would go raiding into northern Mexico, into the Sierra Madres, sometimes they would come back to the reservation communities at San Carlos or White Mountain and take from our people women to bring with them as captives and kept them. So that made life hard, and the Army would crack down, and so they used that as an excuse to not let our people go back to the Verde Valley, back to Prescott area. Yavapai's going back to Prescott or to Camp Verde or Clarkdale. They said, no, as long as this fighting is still going on, you're not going home. And the fighting dragged on until 1886 is when Geronimo's band is finally captured, and then they're sent to the east, eventually to Florida and then Alabama, and now that Fort Sill tribe is in Oklahoma. They didn't even let them come back to Arizona or New Mexico. And so again, this is a motivation for scouting. When other Apache groups are making your life harder, you're willing to go out there and try to bring them back. And so our people did that. And then another thing is, when you're scouting, often the scouts were based out of Camp Verde. If you're from the Verde Valley and the rest of your family is at San Carlos, and you're not allowed to leave under normal circumstances without a pass or permission, well, for potentially 3 to 6 months at a time, you're back home. You're in the Verde Valley. And not all scouting was continuous. You did a lot of time just kind of sitting around sometimes. And so you're back in the homeland for an extended period, and that could be rejuvenating to the soul, I would imagine, to be back in the Verde Valley for an extended time. So that was one of the main reasons, that by scouting it was hoped that it would help make life easier and an easier and quicker transition to peace. A second reason that people scouted was purely economic. It was a job. You got paid. You got paid as much as a regular Army enlisted man. And there's absolutely no question that the money scouts made as regular Army soldiers helped their communities. Think about that. Your people are destitute, starving on a reservation, getting rations that are horrible, putrid meat, very inferior quality food and supplies. Well, a scout gets a paycheck. He can go to the store and buy things, and he can bring that back to a family. And one scout's pay could support an entire extended family. And so when they drew their pay, it was a godsend, literally. There was a scout by the name of John Rope, who was one of Grenville Goodwin's informants back in the 1920s. He was quite elderly, but he had been a scout for several enlistments. And he told Goodwin about receiving his pay of $47 at Fort Thomas for one of his scout enlistments, which included extra for not getting a uniform. Scouts weren't required to wear Army uniforms, and so you got a little extra pay if you didn't take one. And he said, "This money we divided up among our relatives. This is the way we used to do it in those days. Take care of our relatives by giving them clothes and grub. The Indians around here don't do like that now. But scouting fit into an old pattern of taking care of your kin, taking care of family members. And like I said, a scout's pay could support an entire extended family." So that was another main reason for scouting. A third was that scouting allowed for a continuation of a certain type of life. And a lot of the people I've talked to, a lot of the elders said, Yeah, people scouted because you basically could kind of live the old way still. You could be out in the field. You got to carry a gun. You were basically engaging in something that was similar to the raiding and warfare that had been an element of your life previously. So you had freedom of movement. You got to sort of be, a wild Apache again, to use a stereotype. In addition to the pay, scouts got to take spoils on their campaigns. And you can read accounts of scouts who related that when they finally caught up to a renegade camp, an Apache camp of people who were off reservation without permission, they would go into the camp and then they'd find things, and the Army permitted them to take those things and then bring them back home, including captives. And so while bands who had gone off the reservation sometimes took captives from those communities, well then scouts who went and caught up to those camps would take captives and bring them back, sort of as payback in a way. And one of the scouts who was on the Sierra Madre campaign in 1883 said, he related how he had taken a girl captive and gave her to another scout, who then gave her to another scout still. And that scout, when he got this captive girl, started this victory dance. And he said, this is the song of thanks that they used to sing long ago when a successful war party came back. And they gave the victory dance in which men and women danced together. So it's fitting new patterns into old traditions, basically, in that way. So those are some of the reasons that I think are compelling for why scouts served. And it's important to acknowledge those. A desire for the hostilities and war to end quickly so that people could live peacefully, the economic benefit potentially that could be gained from scouting, and then that scouting provided access to a continuing, what we refer to as an older way of life, a life of more freedom. So now let's fast forward decades later. I said, I'm really, really interested in what happened to scouts after all this was up. After 1900, when the so-called Indian Wars were over, after Geronimo's final capture, what happened to these scouts who came home, who went back to their communities? Well, they led interesting lives. Some of them quiet lives. They just reintegrated into community and just lived like they had previously and tried to get along as best they could. But some of them lived very interesting lives and had experiences that I am convinced they wouldn't have had if they hadn't served as scouts. Because being a scout, if you think about it, it gave you a knowledge of American bureaucracy. It gave you economic knowledge. It gave you knowledge, like diplomatic knowledge that you could use for your community. If you had been a scout, the highest you could be as a scout was a sergeant of a scout company. But if you had been a scout officer and you had dealt with Army officers repeatedly over a span of many years, and many of these scouts served multiple enlistments over the course of a couple decades potentially, then you knew how American systems worked. And when the wars are over and your people are suffering, scouts went all the way to Washington, D.C. and met with the President of the United States because they had gained that diplomatic knowledge through scout service. In addition to this, scouts brought benefits to their communities through pensions. And this is an important part of the scout story. Scouts were able to draw a pension from the federal government. And this was actually a promise that was made early on when the scouts started serving. Crook said, I'm the man in charge of all this outfit, and now I'm going to sign my name on this paper so that even if I get killed, the president will still know about what we all did and the record won't be lost. Thus, no matter if I die or live, the government will know that it must reward you. And it did happen. Congress passed a scout pension bill that anyone who had served, and not just Apaches and Yavapais, there were Pawnee scouts, there were Seminole and Creek scouts, there were scouts from a number of tribes. But anyone who had served from a scout between 1859 and 1891, if you'd served at least 6 months, you could get a pension. And the initial pension was quite low. It was only $20 a month. and that was passed in 1917. But then the amount was raised in 1927 to $50 a month. So you could draw a pension of potentially $50 a month. And in the years after the Indian Wars, many, many scouts filed for pensions. And just like scout pay during campaigns could support a whole family, a scout pension could support a whole family. Families like this one in the 1930s who were poor, dirt poor. And this is during the Great Depression, when everybody was poor and Indians were doubly poor. So a scout pension could go a long way for a family like this. And they did draw pensions. But they had a hard time getting their pensions. And I think that it was intentional. I'm convinced that the Army and federal government did everything they could to deny former scouts their pensions. This is Henry Irving, who served a number of enlistments as a scout. He was an Apache, a Dilzhe'e Apache, from Fossil Creek area, but he had family in Payson and in Camp Verde. He had actually several wives, and they were in sort of different areas. His name means the dreamer in Apache. He had powerful medicine. He was known as somebody with medicine. And he'd served several enlistments, and he had a homestead through his scout service in Payson, right there in the middle of town in a place called Indian Hill. And it became sort of a central hub for Tonto Apaches in the Payson area. And he had a title to that land through his scout service to a homestead. And he died, though, and when he died, all of his possessions were buried with him, including that title to the land, and the family lost the land. And Apaches in Payson were actually relegated to Forest Service land outside of town, which eventually they were given a reservation after many, many years. His grandson, Henry Irving's grandson, Milton Chief Campbell, went to Congress in 1972, and a congressional act recognized the Tonto Apache tribe and gave them their land in 1972. Last year was 50 years since their federal recognition. But it was his persistence as a scout and then the persistence of his descendants that led to Payson having a piece of land. Then there was a group of former Yavapai scouts at Fort McDowell. This was the chief. His name was Yuma Frank. He had been a sergeant of a scout company. And in 1903, after the Army had eased restrictions at San Carlos, after about 1900, they let people filter out, not with reservations though, and our people came back to the Verde Valley but didn't have a reservation, but people went back to Fort McDowell area where there was, those are traditional Yavapai homelands. And a group of Fort McDowell Yavapais were there, but they were squatting. They didn't have an actual reservation. So in 1903, Yuma Frank, along with three other leaders, George Dickens and Charles Dickens, I love the names, pretty ridiculous, and another man by the name of Tom Sarama. They went to Washington, D.C. They talked to Congress, they met with various leaders, and specifically, they met with President Roosevelt, TR, this guy, of Rough Rider fame who also loved Indians, and he had this romantic view of the Indians who were the best fighters. And what they did is, after meeting with Roosevelt, they came back to Fort McDowell with an executive order, a paper in hand that created a reservation. You cannot tell me that they could have convinced that guy to sign an order giving them the Fort McDowell reservation there if they hadn't been scouts. I'm sure that they used that, and he saw, famously TR spent 2 weeks as a soldier on vacation, tailored by Brooks Brothers, charged up a hill and then rode that all the way to the presidency. But he loved guys like this, guys who had been scouts and who had served in the real Indian wars. And they came home with a reservation, which I think is pretty significant. And if you go to Fort McDowell today, to their Veterans Memorial, there's their name. Their names are there on the wall. Yuma Frank, Tom Sarama, and others. And then there's this guy, Ismaili, who's also known as Captain Smiley. He was a Dilzhe'e Apache from Camp Verde, who served as a sergeant of a scout company as well. I know we're getting up there in time, but I'll be done soon. This was an interesting case. If you go to the Camp Verde Historical Society Museum right there on Main Street, there's a display that has a photo, this photo, of Captain Smiley. He's also known as Major Smiley. It talks about what he did for the community. He sort of acted as an important go-between for Camp Verde Apaches and Yavapais, and then the white settlers who lived there. That's a tough place to be an Indian, Camp Verde, historically. There's the fort there. There's a long tradition of sort of Indian fighting and Indian hating. And he used his service as a scout to advocate for his people. This is the community character. When you go into Camp Verde, that's what's there greeting you. A flag and a cannon, And why was that cannon there? It was to kill Indians. No other reason. Then there was a guy who lived right around here in Prescott. You might have heard of Mike Burns. Humathiah was his name. It means wet nose. Humathiah was the first citizen Indian in Arizona. He gained his citizenship in 1908, and he had served as a scout, and here he is in his scout uniform posing there. He had been captured as a young boy, but he went on to become a scout and had a really hard life, but he became a citizen of the United States in 1908, and like I said, the very first Indian in Arizona to do so. And it was widely reported regionally that this was a big deal. The Albuquerque Citizen from that year in 1908 said, Yavapai County is all puffed up over the fact that Mike Burns, a full-blood Apache Indian, he was actually Yavapai, has been registered under a recent act of Congress and is entitled to vote in the next election as an American citizen. And he did. He voted consistently from 1908 through about 1930 as Arizona's first citizen Indian. But there's a darker side to all of this, and I'm winding down with this. We're almost at the finish line. This is a medical exam for a former scout by the name of Jim Casey, whose Yavapai name was Manya, and he was from Clarkdale. And when we talk about forgotten veterans today, you hear that term bandied around, and we hear about the Veterans Administration and all the things that are wrong there. These are some of the most forgotten veterans, these former scouts. This guy, Manya, Jim Casey, he tried to get his pension, and this is the medical form that sort of chronicles what condition he was in. And if you look at that, he had all kinds of personal ailments. For example, he had, he was around 80. He had trachoma, which is a painful eye disease. He was hunched over, an enlarged heart, moderate arteriosclerosis, chronic bronchitis, and a large and painful abdominal hernia. His pension was rejected in 1923. And you find many such cases. While his pension was finally approved, it took years of reapplying, and he died in 1933, and when his daughter filed a claim for burial expenses from the Bureau of Pensions, that part of the family lived in Fort McDowell, which is Yavapai territory as well. They sent the response to Fort McDowell, California, which didn't even exist. And so this man, he was a disabled veteran, was only able to claim a pension for a few short years before he died, and his children didn't receive funeral benefits. There was another scout from Clarkdale named George Beauty, and he filed for a pension in 1921, took a year, was rejected in 1922, and then again it was rejected in 1924. His case was recalled in 1927. And as it turns out, he had served at least 5 enlistments as a scout dating back to the 1870s, lasting through the 1890s. One problem that they had at the Bureau of Pensions was that Apaches and Yavapais often have numerous names throughout the course of their lives. And the name you had in old age was not necessarily the name you had as a young man serving in the Army as a scout. And in addition, they would ask you for paperwork. Well, what's your birth year? Give us all this information. And none of these people, I don't know what year I was born. And so the Army used all of that as a way to turn these pensions down. And they did it consistently. That same Henry Irving, who had served several scout enlistments, his pension was denied. If you look at the photo, he had suffered a debilitating wound to his knee, which troubled him the rest of his life, and also was partially blind in an eye from a wound he received on a campaign. You can see it in his eye there. And the Army turned him down for his pension application for a number of years, until it was finally approved. And so what did Scouts do in the face of all of this type of treatment? I want to go back to the case of the aforementioned Smiley, because I think it's an amazing story. Smiley began inquiring after a pension as early as 1919, so he was a little ahead of the curve compared to some. And while there's no question that he had served as a scout, he apparently liked to tell stories about himself and his service. He claimed to be a chief of the Tonto Apaches. He also claimed to have personally captured Geronimo, which is absolutely not true. And again, he was referred to as Major Smiley sometimes. There were no majors in the Scouts. The highest you could be was a sergeant. But yet, he did this. And apparently he had a medal, which was, some have said it was a Distinguished Service Medal for his campaigns, his services against Geronimo in the Geronimo campaigns. But some have told me that the medal actually was made by a lawyer in Jerome by the name of Rutherford. But he would wear that medal around and show it to people. So let me be clear, he did serve as a scout, absolutely. And he was known to many Verde Valley residents, both Indian and non-Indian. And while it's entirely possible that he was on that last Geronimo campaign and maybe contributed in some significant way, he did not personally capture Geronimo. But more interest to me than the truthfulness of his claims and the stories that he told is the fact that even if they were embellished, we clearly see in Smiley a man who recognized the value of scout service. That to refer to himself as a major and a chief, to wear a medal and to claim he had personally captured a famous renegade could be leveraged for respect from whites and perhaps better treatment for his people. If he was exaggerating, I don't care, good for him. He had every right to do that, especially at a time when most whites in the 19-teens and 20s would have just as soon seen us disappear for good. But we didn't, and partially it was thanks to people like this. That's it for today. Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent. We have time for a few questions. And Dr. Crandall, if you don't mind repeating the question so the folks
Sure.
at home can hear it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Go here in the back.
There are 3 or 4 Indian scouts buried here in Prescott at the Prescott National Cemetery, recognized as veterans.
Right.
And on their headstone is engraved Indian Scout.
Right.
It does not give you the tribe,
Huh.
but if you wander through the cemetery right near the VA hospital,
And
there
there-
are about 4.
So the comment was that there were about 4 scouts buried in the cemetery here, the military cemetery, with gravestones indicating that they served as scouts. But it doesn't say tribe. Is that what you said?
Well, I don't think there was room,
Okay. I would assume Yavapai is from Prescott area, maybe?
hopefully.
Um,
They were recognized as veterans, and that's why
Right.
they have been buried in the Prescott National Cemetery.
Right. The gravestones of scouts at Fort McDowell in their cemetery there have their military gravestones, but they're buried there in that place, not in the National Cemetery. And they say the scout and that's the scout company typically. It'll say Company C Scouts and the years, so they'll have the range of their service. Interestingly, though, Mike Burns, his gravestone I'd looked for it several times and never found it, and then I realized the reason I didn't find it is because he doesn't have a military gravestone, and it just says Mike Burns' father, and his wife, whose name was Hattie, she was known as Hattie Burns' mother, and those are the only things on the gravestones. But all the others have military gravestones, as well as their names on that memorial wall as scouts, and it says Yavapai Scouts there, yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, sure. Right, that's a good question. The question was, as I mentioned earlier, it's hard for our people to talk about this, that it's a difficult topic because there's a lot of pain involved, and you also don't typically talk about the dead. There are taboos, but has what I've done helped in maybe bringing some healing? And I don't know necessarily on a large scale. I don't want to say, oh, it's so impactful. But I gave a talk in Clarkdale a while back, which is actually where I met Nikki, and it sort of led to this. And there were several members of my tribe there. And when they came, and some of them publicly during comment question section said, I grew up here, I've lived here my whole life, and I've never heard about this, and it's never taught in our schools. And thank you for bringing these stories to the surface, that it is important. So I think the answer in some small way is yes, I think so. You can't heal from something if you aren't willing to talk about it and acknowledge it, and then go from there. But that was probably the best part of that talk is that experience of seeing people and getting a hug, and saying these were my relatives and they've never been acknowledged in this way. So that's what I hope to do, and that's the reason I do the work. It's not necessarily the book that will result, although that will be rewarding, but more rewarding is that sort of interaction, which I hope will continue. Yeah, yep, yeah. Any other questions? Sure.
Yeah, I wondered about the fact that the scouts were not wearing uniforms. Was that to sort of mingle more easily among different tribes, or
right.
more easily, or?
Sure, that's a good question too. The question was about the fact that most scouts didn't wear uniforms, and what was the motivation? Was that to allow them to be able to sort of be in the field easier and mingle among different groups? The answer is sometimes they would wear a mixed uniform, so breech clout but an army jacket, moccasins but an army shirt. And you'll see sort of variations of different degrees. I think part of it was you wore what you were comfortable in, and if you had lived your whole life in moccasins and breech clout and a shirt, then that's what you wanted to wear. And an army uniform is terribly uncomfortable, especially in that time. Wool, you're wearing wool in the field. It's scratchy, it's hot. One thing that most of the scouts did wear was a red bandana. And that was so that they could be identified by the regular army soldiers that they were serving with. Because if you didn't have something that marked you, then you could get shot. If you're in the heat of battle against renegades, what marker do you have? And so the scouts often wore red bandanas, and you'll see depictions of them, and they've got the red bandanas in the field. And that became sort of a de facto uniform that was characteristic of the scouts. But I think the main reason that they didn't wear regular army uniforms is because they didn't want to. You didn't want to wear those trousers and a wool jacket. I mean, can you imagine campaigning in July in Arizona wearing that kind of thing? Yeah, no way. Yeah. Yeah.
Did horses play an important role for the scouts?
So the question is, did horses play an important role for the scouts? Yes and no. When they were in the most difficult country during the Tonto Basin campaigns in 72 and 73, horses were not a big part of that, because if you've been to Salt River Canyon, where some of the major engagements take place, you can't take a horse in that country. You can't. And so that's why Crook rode a mule. A mule can do that. And so actually mules played a bigger part. And they're good as pack animals. They're more sure-footed They can carry a heavier load. They can't move as fast, but you're not moving for speed in this situation. You want reliability and you want sure-footedness when you're going down almost cliff faces. And so mules played a more important part. In later campaigns where you're covering more ground, horses to some extent, but most scouts went on foot. That was just the preferred method. But they would certainly take horses and bring them home. And if you got a good horse on a campaign, then you brought that back. But a lot of people don't also know that horses, for Apaches, they were to be used, and often they were ridden sort of to death. You'd ride a horse until it died, and then you would eat it. And horses were a food source for Apaches. You'd eat horses, very common. Horses for scout companies, potentially, but Apaches had horse herds. I mean, they were people who were accustomed to traveling by horse, so you might have your own horse that you used. But it's a good question. Yeah. Yes and no. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. In that most rugged country, you're not going to take a horse. You don't want to ride a horse down the rim. It's dangerous. A horse will break a foot, it'll trip. Whereas on your own feet, you can go. And if you need to carry something, put it on a mule, and it'll pack it out. Yeah. Oh.
Any last questions? Oh, we got one more.
Sure.
I was just curious, were the Apache Scouts well received by the regular cavalry? As you're speaking, I feel like I know it's two separate situations, but there's a resemblance to what's going on with the Afghan translators.
Yeah. Right.
And so, but most of us would have done anything for them because they're keeping us alive.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering how regular troops
Right.
felt about their counterparts.
Yeah. Sure. So the question was, what regular Army soldiers, enlisted men potentially, thought of scouts? How were they received? What were those interactions like? I think that those who were deeply racist towards Native peoples, that probably came out in those relationships. We don't have as many accounts from regular Army soldiers that go into great detail about scouts. What we do have is more from the officers. So Charles Gatewood, John Burke, who were commissioned officers, lieutenants and captains and above, and their praise is pretty much universal. They just said we liked them. They fought well, they had a good sense of humor. A lot of them remark on that the scouts, they'd get to a point of familiarity where they had served with each other so much that they became friends, and they would joke around with each other. There was some familiarity. They weren't best buddies, but there was some affinity there. And you see that in their accounts. And, Burke, Crook, others, when Geronimo's band, when the Chiricahuas were taken to Fort Marion in Florida in '86, they actually took people who had served as scouts as well. Even in that last campaign to get Geronimo, they just threw them all in one group and sent them to Florida in trains. And some of the people who made the loudest protest were officers who had served with those scouts and said, okay, maybe the so-called renegades, but what about the scouts? They helped us. They've been with us for a long time. We know them. We couldn't have done it without them. Why are you sending them away as well? And so there was an attitude among some, which is, I think, similar to the point you make about those who worked with the U.S. Military in Afghanistan and places like that. At a certain point, yeah, there's a level of familiarity and friendship and a desire to help those people out. But what a horrible situation, to be in. You're working for a colonizer, essentially. And if history teaches us one thing, is in the end, you can't trust a colonizer. I'm sorry. Yeah. Sure.
All right. One more time for Dr. Maurice Crandall.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And as a special surprise token of our thanks, we have a Natural History Institute hat.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. As Connie will attribute, I am a hat person. I'm definitely a hat
Fantastic.
person. So
We just got new colors in if you're interested in matching. Hooray!
there you go. I'm wearing blue. It's perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So thank you all so much for coming out tonight. If you haven't had a chance, our art gallery is open. We currently have a show called The Art of Natural History. It's historical natural history prints. So have a good night. Thank you.